My dear friends, my great-grandfather was named Godfrey Schulz. He was a public school teacher in South Milwaukee, mostly during the 1940s and the 1950s. Godfrey was an excellent teacher by those who knew him, or according to those who knew him and saw him work. He had a lot of leadership gifts. He actually went back to school. He went to Marquette University and got his master's in public education and leadership. He had served as a principal for the Lutheran grade school system for a long time. And yet, even though he had the tenure, even though he had the experience, even though he had the gifts, he just could not get a principal job in the public school system. And it seemed like every time he applied to be a principal, whenever there was an opening, someone else would get chosen, someone usually younger with less tenure, less education, less qualifications. And he just couldn't get the principal gig. Why not? Well, it's because Godfrey was not a Freemason. The Freemasons are a secret men's society, and they go back more than 100 years. They've been around for a while, and you have a presence pretty much in every town in America and in other places in the world too. Not much is known about them and what they do in their meetings because it is a secret society. But what we do know is that the Freemasons, in order to be a Freemason, you have to swear an oath to God, and you have to partake in their worship services to God. But here's the tricky thing. They define God not as Jesus or the Christian God, but as kind of like a bunch of gods from a bunch of different religions kind of mushed together. And so according to the Bible, they worship what we would consider a false God. So why does anyone join? Why do people join the Freemasons? It's probably not because they have specific, they buy into all the religious views of God, or their version of God. It's mostly because of the connections. Right? You probably know this, right? In the business world, in the public, whatever job you have, it's often not about what you know, but who you know. Right? The people that get the promotions, the people that have a lot of success, the people that get ahead. A lot of times it's not always the people that are most gifted or the hardest working, but often the people who just know the right people. And so in Godfrey's case, the superintendent of the public school system was a Freemason. And the guys that kept getting the promotions over Godfrey were all Freemasons. And so they had those connections, and that's why Godfrey didn't get it. So why didn't he join? Well, because Godfrey was a devout Christian man, and he knew that the Freemasons would, you had to worship their version of God, and he made the choice that because Jesus is so good and so kind and so forgiving, that Jesus is worth it, that he gladly would sacrifice the extra money or the benefits or the status that he would have gotten if he joined. That whatever this earth could offer him, it was nothing compared to what Jesus had in store for him. This was a sacrifice that he considered worth making because Jesus is so good. And I know for a fact that the men of this congregation, especially years ago, made similar kinds of sacrifices. Especially, again, in a smaller town like Whitewater, where, you got to have connections, right? You got to know the right people if you're going to get ahead in the business world. If you're going to have success in whatever business you're doing, you got to know people. And in a town like Whitewater, where the Masonic Lodge was very big, very powerful, and also called St. John's for some reason, it would have been very tempting for the men of this congregation to join that lodge and worship that false god so that they could get ahead in the business world. And yet the members of this congregation, a lot of them, probably your fathers and grandfathers, chose not to. And I also know from the older people that have told me stories from when they were children, that they remember seeing that fathers would often drop off their children and their wives after worship at St. John's, but then they themselves, they would go to a different church to worship. Because St. John's was one of the only churches in this town that actually said, no, if you're going to be a member of this church, if you're going to worship with us and take part in our Lord's Supper, well, then you got to choose what God you're worshiping. right? You can't worship the true God on Sunday and then worship a false God on every other Monday at the Mason meetings, right? That's a hypocrisy, right? Choose your God. And the congregation, the reputation of the congregation likely suffered a little bit in this town. That was a sacrifice that the people of this congregation decided was worth making, again, because Jesus is so good. Now, the reason I tell you that is because the people of Thyatira, the city where we're talking, the church in the city we're talking about today, made similar sacrifices. The persecution that they dealt with, it probably wasn't quite as intense as the cities that we've talked about in the last few weeks, like Ephesus, Smyrna, and Pergamum. It wasn't quite as intense. They probably weren't being hunted down and killed like the other cities. But something to know about Thyatira, it was a smaller town. It was a very blue-collar kind of town. It was a center of industry. So the textiles, the materials, the leathers, the metalwork, that was what came out of Thyatira and was distributed throughout what is now Western Turkey. That was the kind of town that Thyatira was. A lot of blue-collar types, a lot of farmers, a lot of stonemasons, a lot of people that worked with cloths and leathers, a lot of people that worked with their hands. And just like today, when you need connections and to know the right people to get ahead in business, it was the same thing 2,000 years ago. Right? You needed connections, you needed to know the right people. And so what people would do is that they would form guilds, G-U-I-L-D, guilds. And so each labor force kind of had their own guild. There was a mason guild, there was a metalworker guild, there was a tailor guild, there's all these different guilds. And they would provide you with protection, they would provide you with connection, they would provide you with a lot of job opportunities. It was really important to be a part of these guilds, these groups. But just kind of like the Freemasons, make you, worship their God. Well, the guilds each had their own God that they would worship as well. And in order to be a member of the guild, you would have to worship their God in their worship services and eat meat that was sacrificed to their God as a way of submitting yourself to that God. And the Christians refused. The Christians taught that, no, you don't get to worship the true God on Sunday and the false God during the week. That's hypocrisy. No. And so the Christians in Thyatira, especially the ones that worked with their hands, well, they suffered a little. They had to make a hard sacrifice. And Jesus addresses them in this letter and says, good work. Good work. But first of all, Jesus affirms what they know to be true when he says, I am the Son of God. There is no other God besides me. All those gods are false. I am the true God, and I do not share my glory with anyone. So Jesus makes it very clear he is the only God to be worshipped. But then he also says, my eyes are like blazing flames of fire. Jesus sees everything. He sees the motivations of the heart. He sees behind everything. You cannot fool Jesus. And then he says, my feet are like furnished bronze. They're solid. They're immovable. So what he's saying is that his truth doesn't change. Right? If he says something is wrong, then it's not going to be right 10 years later. Right? He's not going to change his mind. His stance on everything is immovable. And the church in Thyatira knew. They knew that, and they were growing in their faith. Jesus says, hey, you are growing. They're probably growing in their evangelism and had more people worship for them, but they were also growing in faith. They were growing in service. So this church was more sacrificial, more selfless, more loving, more faithful, more joyful in Jesus than they were before. And Jesus commends them for it. He says, yes, I do this, but you have a cancer. You have a cancer that, left untreated, will absolutely destroy you. There's a woman in the midst of this congregation. And understand something. A lot of early churches, especially 2,000 years ago, they didn't probably function the way that we function today. We have like this group of people that come together on Sunday in this big building and then worship together and then kind of go off and do our thing. That's really not probably how this church was. It was probably more like a collection of smaller house churches, smaller groups that worship in their houses. And then you had a group of elders that would maybe go to these house churches, and then maybe once in a while they get all together. But these groups of worship together, read God's word together, study together several times a week. And one of these house churches had this woman, whose name I guarantee was not actually Jezebel. Right, I guarantee her name wasn't Jezebel, because when you read in the Old Testament lesson, no one in their right mind would ever named their daughter Jezebel. But Jesus is clear and says this woman does exactly what Jezebel was doing, leading my people away from me and doing horrible things. Yes, this woman claimed to be a prophetess, or it's someone who has divine revelation from God, direct messages from God, and that's what she claimed. And it's not unheard of. You see in the New Testament, you have prophetesses, you have women who do have direct revelation from God and share God's word with the churches. You do have that. But this woman was a fraud. This woman was an absolute fraud. She wasn't getting direct revelation from God. She was preaching what the people wanted to hear. Essentially, you could have your God, and you could have your sex, and your false gods too. But Jezebel was sleeping with other Christians. And she was encouraging the Christians to do the same. And she was encouraging the Christians, especially the ones that worked with their hands, go ahead, join those guilds, worship the other gods. Especially if it's good for your business and your success and your status in the community, God doesn't mind that. And Jesus says, I am going to kill her and those that listen to her. You think about that. That's what Jesus says. I am going to destroy her. I'm going to put her on a bed of suffering. She is going to suffer. And her children, her followers, those that listen to her and who join in her immorality are going to die. And Jesus says, all the churches are going to know exactly what I think of this, exactly how strict I am about sin, and exactly how I feel about lies and deception in my church. So Jesus says to the rest of the church, those who haven't followed her, those who aren't tricked by her, I don't tell you to do anything special, nothing extravagant. Just get away from her and hold on to what you know is true. And in the end, Jesus promises that he's going to give them something so wonderful, so beautiful, so powerful, so glorious that they can't even fathom how wonderful it is. Well, that's the message to the church in Thyatira. Wow. I think we have a lot to talk about. There's two things that we need that we can take from this. And they're printed off in your bulletin here when you see the sermon. Point number one, tolerant doesn't mean loving. And strict, number two, strict doesn't mean hateful. Point number one, tolerant doesn't mean loving. You've experienced this. Sometimes when I'm in town and I say, I'm the pastor at St. John's, people will say, oh, so you're the strict? Oh, you're the strict church. Anyone else have that experience? You're the strict ones. And I guess I never really quite know how to respond to that. The reason I would say, my opinion is, the reason that people say that is because a lot of churches in America, some churches in this town, really, really like to talk about tolerance. Tolerance. The idea that, whatever you want to believe about God, as long as it's not too crazy, and however you want to define what it means to be a Christian and what's good and evil and right and bad, however you want to define that, you can kind of have your own opinion. You kind of have, do whatever you want, as long as you try to be a loving person. That's what really matters. And that seems very tolerant, very open. And first of all, Jesus doesn't teach that, but so therefore we don't. But also, I'd like to make the case for you. That idea, that teaching, not only is it not loving, it's also not very tolerant. It's not loving. Do any of you know the name Penn Jillette? Penn Jillette. If you've ever been to Las Vegas, maybe you know who that is. Penn Jillette is this world-famous illusionist magician. He and Penn and Teller, they have this really big, cool, awesome magic show in Las Vegas, and they're very famous and very gifted. They do great shows. Penn Jillette is also an outspoken, hardened atheist. He does not like religion, he does not like Christianity, and he doesn't really like Christians that much either. And he's very open about saying it. But I'm going to share with you a quote that he actually says. This is what Penn Jillette, the hardened atheist, actually says. He says this: I don't respect Christians who don't proselytize. Proselytize, that's kind of a negative nuance. Proselytize essentially means aggressive evangelism, where you would actually go up with someone and say, "Hey, I think you're on your way to hell, and I have the truth, and you need to believe the truth, and I want to believe the truth because I'm afraid that you're going to hell." That's proselytizing, trying to convince someone to believe what you believe, right? He says, "I don't respect Christians who don't do that." Well, why not? He says this. How much do you have to hate someone to believe that hell is real and that everlasting life is possible? But then this is an atheist saying. Now, he's not a Christian, he doesn't believe in Christianity. But he also says, listen, the Christians that say, "Oh, well, whatever you want to believe, oh, whatever, that's fine, just be a good person." He says, I don't respect. If you truly believe that hell is real and that heaven is a possibility, you have to hate someone not to say anything. And if you're standing on the side of a river and there's a cliff that goes 100 feet down, and there's a person in their canoe just canoeing their way toward that cliff, would it really be loving to say, "Well, it's his canoe. I can't tell what to do with his canoe." Right? Who am I to judge his canoe? It's his canoe. What direction he wants. Who am I to say that he's going to go down? Is that love? No. That's not loving at all. That's really hateful. So again, according to Jesus, according to an atheist, and really according to common sense, it's not loving to just tolerate everything, especially to tolerate things that Jesus clearly doesn't tolerate. That's not loving. But I'll also say this. It's really not that tolerant. Some of you know that this church is part of what we call the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod. It's essentially, it's what we call a denomination, or a larger group of churches that all believe the same thing and work together. That we're part of the WELS, right? That's what we call it, the WELS. The WELS, though, you should know, it's not the only denomination in America. You should know that. And it's also not one of the biggest denominations in America. It's actually relatively small. There is a Christian denomination that's one of the biggest in America. And a few years ago, they had a really important meeting with the leaders of the denomination and thousands of pastors in this big conference room. And they were having this big meeting of this entire church synod, all these churches. And the question that they were going through, the question that they were kind of wrestling with is, are we going to teach that it's necessary to believe in Jesus in order to go to heaven? Like that's what they were, are we going to teach that it's necessary to believe in Jesus to be saved? Which, that's kind of a big deal, right? It's kind of a big deal. That's a big one. And really the answer that they were coming up with was no. They were essentially saying, we are going to be tolerant of all different kinds of religions, all different kinds of ideas about God, even ideas that reject Jesus and say that Jesus isn't who he says he is and that he's not the way to salvation. And they actually have members of other religions on the stage that they communicate, we are all one. We all believe the same thing. We're all, it's all the same thing. And there was one pastor there that went up to the microphone as they were discussing this. And he said, "I'm sorry, this is wrong." In front of all the thousands of people, he said, "I'm sorry, this is wrong." And he quotes John 14. He quoted John 14, where Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." And he said, well, "I'm sorry, this is the truth. And we should abide by the truth, even if it's an inconvenient truth." And do you know how all of the people in the room responded to him and responded to the words of Jesus? They shook their heads at him. They moaned and groaned. Ugh. They're disgusted. And then another pastor came to the microphone and said, "I am quite frankly embarrassed that we're even having this conversation in front of our interfaith or non-Christian brothers and sisters." And everyone cheered. Everyone said, "Yes, yes, good for you." And the vote, they voted to, they now no longer teach that you have to believe in Jesus to be saved. And that won by a landslide in the vote. Now, we can argue whether or not this is something Jesus teaches. I think there's plenty of places where Jesus is very clear about you have to believe in him to be saved. But I want to ask you this. Did those people sound very tolerant to you? Did they sound tolerant? Were they tolerant of their brother pastor who dared to disagree with them? Were they tolerant of the words of Jesus himself, who dared to disagree with their notions of what love is? They sounded very tolerant. No, in fact, they sounded, dare I say it, strict. Strict about their non-strictness and intolerant of anyone who doesn't share their opinion of what tolerance is. And the reason I say this is because this is just true. Every church is strict about something. Every church is strict about something. You're never going to find a truly tolerant church. Every church is intolerant or doesn't allow something, right? Every church does. The question is not whether or not we're strict, but are we strict about the things that Jesus is strict about? And so that goes to point number 2. Strict doesn't mean hateful. Would you agree with this statement? Jesus is loving. Do you agree with that statement? Do you think Jesus is loving? Yeah? Is Jesus loving? Yes. Is Jesus kind? Yes. Is Jesus forgiving? Yes. Is Jesus patient? Yes. But I want you to also look at what he says. Is Jesus strict? Yeah. Is Jesus strict in the Old Testament when he says to Jezebel and Ahab, you are going to pay for what you've done? Yes. Does Jesus seem a little strict to you when he says hell is real and hell is eternal and your sin might send you there, so you don't stay away from whatever's going to send you to hell? Does he seem a little strict? Yeah. Does Jesus seem strict when he says, I value truth so much and I love my people so much that anyone that causes them to stumble, to sin, or to believe something false about me, whoever's responsible for that, it'd be better for them to have a millstone hung around their neck and drown in the depths of the sea. Does Jesus seem a little bit strict when he says that? I think so. And does Jesus seem a little bit strict when he's talking to the church in Thyatira? Yes. So what can we say then? Jesus is absolutely infinitely loving, and he's absolutely and infinitely strict. But the question is, what's Jesus strict about? Jesus is strict about idolatry, worshiping other gods, and serving other gods. Something about this Jezebel woman, right? You have to ask the question, like, how did this woman influence and convince all these Christians that they should sleep with her? It's kind of extreme. Well, we get this from what Jesus says when he says the so-called deep things. It seems like Jezebel, who was probably a very charismatic, powerful speaker, someone that was probably also very attractive. What she was likely telling Christians was that, well, if you really want to get to know the secrets, if you really want to get to know God at a secret, deeper level, if you really want to be a smart, sophisticated Christian, well, then you can't just, go by the dogmatic, narrow view of some people in the Bible. No, you have to experience everything. And we need to experience each other on a deeper level, which she would say, okay, so let's sleep together. And you need to experience what it's like to know other gods. So therefore, join the guilds and worship the other. She's promising something. She's promising that if people listen to her, they will have a deeper knowledge of God, and they'll be smart. They'll be nuanced. They'll be sophisticated. And in Greek culture, that's all anyone wanted. They wanted to be smart. They didn't want to be a dumb. You understand something? This is how idolatry works. False gods always promise you something. They always promise to give you something, and they take, and they take, and they take, and they never quite give you what they promised. The gods of the ancient world, they promised fertility, they promised prosperity, they promised strength, they promised power, and they took, and they took, and they took, and people were crushed. The same thing is true today. The God of attractiveness promises you, especially the young folks, that if you're thin enough, if you lift enough weights, if you starve yourself enough, if you look attractive enough and you have the good enough physique, well, then ultimately you will be enough. The God of affirmation and approval promises you that if the right people approve of you, and your boss thinks you're good enough, and if your friends approve of you enough, and if your family approves of you enough, if Mrs. Right thinks you're attractive enough, if enough people at work think you're good enough and respect you, if you have enough approval, then you will ultimately be enough. That the God of money and success and achievement promises that if you achieve enough and make enough money and rise enough above everyone else, then you will be enough. It's slavery. Because what happens when you finally get that promotion, when you get enough likes on Instagram, when you finally, look the way that you want it to look, what happens? It's not enough. And you need more and more and more and more. And the crazy thing is, too, the false god of the Freemasons, which is kind of the false god of also a lot of churches in America that says, well, it doesn't really matter about your theology. It doesn't really matter what you believe. It doesn't really matter most things. Just be a good person. That's all that matters. Just be a good person. That sounds really liberating. That sounds good. But here's the... How do you know that you've done enough? How do you know that you are a good enough person? How do you know that you are as tolerant and as open-minded and as kind and as generous and as compassionate as Jesus wants you to be? How do you know? You don't. And if that's how you look at God, and if that's what you believe, you will go to your grave not really knowing if you've done enough. Good luck. Good luck. See, this is why Jesus cares so much. When we worship other gods, we're not just depriving Jesus of the glory that he deserves as the true God. We are robbing ourselves of the joy and the comfort that Jesus desperately wants us to have, because Jesus is an altogether different kind of God. Other gods say, hey, you need to serve me. Jesus says, no, I'm going to become your servant. Jesus, the true God of heaven and earth, so big that he can fit the universe in his hands, and he became small. He became weak. He became vulnerable. He became nothing. In fact, he actually became so nothing that people decided to kill him. They decided to strip him naked and execute him on a cross, and he hung there naked while people laughed at him. Why? So that you and I could be beautiful. So that you and I could be absolutely perfect in God's eyes. See, the gods tell you, hey, if you do enough, then I'll give you something. Jesus says, no, I'm going to give it to you for free. I'm going to earn it with my death, the death that you deserve. And then I'm going to give you my perfection, my goodness. And also, look what he says. His glory. His glory. Jesus promises you that there is going to be a time that you will be so perfect, so beautiful, so breathtaking, so glorious, so righteous that actually if you saw it today, you'd faint. You climbed you. That is your future. That is what you are going to look like in the new heavens and the new earth. And Jesus gives it all to you for free. But here's something you need to realize. That's how Jesus sees you now. Because of what he's done on the cross for you, because he's taken your punishment, that is how Jesus sees you now. Absolutely perfect, absolutely enough. And the reason that's so important is because while you're in this world, you are going to have times where you feel absolutely hopeless. You are going to have times where you feel absolutely worthless. You're going to feel afraid. You're going to feel insecure. You're going to feel angry. You're going to feel like a failure, a disappointment. What do? How do you deal with it? Well, we always want to go to the false gods, and maybe they can make us feel a little bit better. What do? Grow as a Christian and deal with the hard things of this world by learning to see yourself as Jesus sees you. By learning to see yourself as Jesus sees you. And as you do, you, along with the Christians of Thyatira, along with the Christians that have gone on before us, along with guys like Godfrey Schulz, you will not be enslaved by the false gods. You will be absolutely fair in God's eyes. That's who you are. You won't be enslaved. You will not settle for anyone less than Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the bright morning star, who is going to give you his glory. Amen.